Okay, good morning. So one thing, so perhaps we should say who we are. Our names are on the program, but my name's Mike Parker. I'm from Oxford in the UK.
Hi, my name is Peg Yong. I work in the University of Oxford office in Bangkok. It's called the Mahidol Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit.
And before we start, we wanted to remind you about the posters at the back of the room. So we wanted to encourage you during coffee breaks and lunch breaks to make sure you take a look at those. People have put a lot of work into them. They're very impressive. It's a really nice range of posters. So please do take the time to have a look at those. So our role this morning is not to simply kind of sum up what happened yesterday, because you were all there. And you were all in the discussion groups. We'll be getting feedback later in the day from the various people who've taken notes and rapporteurs from the group. So we don't see our job as just saying what happened, because you already know that. So to say make a few comments which hopefully will add something to the discussion yesterday, but also maybe open up a space for a bit of discussion later on today. The next session starts in about 20 minutes, and that's on equity. So depending on how long we speak for, there's maybe a bit of time for a quick discussion, but more likely what we'll do is we'll hand over to the next session. So our role really is to sort of throw a few ideas out there and spark off some thoughts, really. As I say, so I'm going to go first, and then Pei Kyung will go after me. The official themes that we focused on yesterday and were brought into the discussion groups following the case studies were firstly on the idea of respecting participants and communities. So that was the first discussion. And then the next two were both on good governance. The first one was on good governance thinking at a national level, and the second one was good governance thinking internationally. If your group was anything like my group, we actually went all over that. We talked about a whole range of different things that were related to each other. We didn't exactly stick to the topic, but they formed a really nice way for getting the discussion going. And the case studies were really helpful, I thought, in making that happen. As I say, I'm not going to repeat the things we talked about yesterday, but that was sort of where we were. So what I'm going to do now is just say a few things that I think hopefully add to that. One of the things that struck me about yesterday, and we didn't say enough about it, and I think maybe we should, as ethicists, be thinking about this more, is about the ethical importance of the value of science and the value of scientific resources. And so, for example, biobanks, data collections, and so on, the purpose of establishing them, at least in most cases, is that the idea that scientific progress increasingly requires much larger data sets, requires international collaborations, requires samples to be stored in a systematic way and to be shared. So the starting point for the creation, this raises the question about what a biobank is. And one of the things that happened yesterday, I think, was we shifted a bit between different ways of talking about biobanks. So on some occasions, we were simply talking about any collection of samples and data that are all kind of stored in one place. That's one way of thinking about a biobank. A biobank is essentially a reasonably systematically organized collection of samples and data. But sometimes we shifted towards the idea that a biobank is a collection of that type, specifically set up to promote sharing and research and use. So more like a sort of library, which is designed so that people will actually read the books. And so I think that seems to me quite important. If something is specifically set up to be a resource for sharing for research, then the ethical questions start to be about, well, what kind of uses are acceptable? How should access be used? Whereas if you've got a sample collection which has emerged in some other way through, for example, the creation of a health service, as we heard, for example, about the example from the Cape here, then the question is, should this be accessed at all? But if you've decided in advance to set this up as a research resource, that question shouldn't be on the agenda. The agenda is how should it be used rather than whether it should be used. But I think it raises, the overarching point is, I think as ethicists, we tend to talk as if all of the ethical questions are to do with problems associated with science. And we don't speak enough, I don't think, sometimes about the ethical importance of doing research that's going to hopefully benefit people. So that was one thing that struck me about yesterday. We didn't perhaps talk enough about the moral value of scientific endeavor. So that's, clearly that's not the whole thing, but that's an important issue. The second issue, which I thought came out yesterday for me, and again, wasn't explicitly taught. We talk often about the limitations of consent. So, when consent is done, it's often difficult to do it well. When community engagement is done, it's often difficult to do it well. And the background here is that what we're thinking about here is what we ought to be thinking about is what counts as ethical research in the context of an imperfect world. It's not possible to do everything absolutely perfectly in the kinds of contexts in which we're talking about. It's rarely possible to get absolutely perfect understanding. It's rarely possible to be confident that people aren't subject to kinds of pressures which push them towards doing research. It isn't possible to do perfect community engagement. So if we accept that, then the question is, to some extent, what counts as good ethical practice in the context of an imperfect world? What's good enough? And that's not to ask. I'm not suggesting we should have lower standards, but I'm saying that we can only have an obligation to do something if it's possible to do it. So the question for me, I think, is what counts as high ethical standards in the real world, as opposed to high ethical standards in an article, in a paper. And I think that's quite a hard thing to think through. The ethical answer from a bioethicist can't simply be, if you can't get perfect consent, you can't do the research. That just seems not to take seriously the moral value of scientific endeavor. So the question is, how do we think about good enough, high quality research in the real world in an imperfect world? And we don't often, I think, enough acknowledge the imperfections of the world we work in. So I'm not going to say anything more about consent and community engagement because Pei Kyung's going to say something more about that. But I do think, the question I asked yesterday, which was, to what question is community engagement the answer? I think is actually quite an important question to ask. I don't know what the answer is myself, but I do think we don't often enough say to ourselves, why community engagement? Why are we doing it? What's its role? What's its normative role in this kind of space? Related to that, I think that even when they're done well, we sometimes, in bioethics, we've got a tendency, maybe not academic bioethics, but certainly when we're talking about the role of ethics, ethics guidelines, regulators and so on, we tend to place a lot of weight on one thing or another. So historically, we've tended to see consent, for example, as doing all the work. If you can get really good consent, then the project's ethical. And as we've started to recognize that really good quality consent is sometimes difficult to achieve, we say, oh, okay, maybe consent can't do all the work. So now I had the feeling yesterday we'd shifted from consent to community engagement. The idea that community engagement is the new informed consent somehow. If you can do really good community engagement, then you've solved all your ethical problems. And I'm suspicious of that. I'm suspicious of one answer resolutions to these things. I think a good question to ask would be, if we accept that consent and community engagement are going to be imperfect and there are always going to be problems associated with them, against that background, what other things do we need to do in order to ensure that people are not going to be unduly harmed through research, they're not going to be discriminated through as a result of research? And I think it opens up a whole space then about questions relating to justice, equity, fairness, appropriate protections, acceptable risks, and those kind of questions, which have tended historically to be sidelined by this kind of slight obsession with consent. And I'm slightly worried that we're moving to the idea that community engagement is now going to solve all our problems. So this leads in a way to my last comment, which is one of the questions this leads to is, what do we think in a biobank, where biobank research is going to be done? What do we think is required to create the conditions for well-founded trust and confidence in populations in the kinds of things that science is doing? So not just trust, so not just people trusting, but well-founded trust. What do we think what do we think is required to give people good reason to have trust and confidence in a biobank? And that, I think, requires us to rethink, or at least think about the relationship between science, healthcare, and society in a way that is quite difficult in some of the settings that we're talking about in this kind of setting. So I find one of the things that leads me to think about is thinking about ethics from a more social contract type of way of thinking about it. So how should we rethink the relationship between science, society, and health in such a way that it provides some kind of background justification for the kinds of activities we were discussing yesterday. And the idea of a social contract is attractive, but it's problematic. So it's problematic enough if you're in a coherent, well-structured society with lots of resources. But even in those settings, it's a very difficult kind of idea. What kind of contract, who should be involved, so on. But many of the settings we're talking about here are going to be places where the institutions are less, there's conflict, there may be inadequate processes for the discussion of these kind of things. So I think there's a kind of philosophical project which is related to the idea of a bioethics-related social contract in the context of global health research. And I think potentially that's a research agenda that someone in the room could pursue. So I'm going to stop there because I've gone on enough and hand over to Baek-Kyung.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to pull out two things that was very interesting to me, at least, is the consent discussion. So I think we talked quite a lot about different consent models, and I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So we've got specific consent or dynamic consent, so consent for a specific piece of work. We've got broad consent, so consent within limits, which means that it's not anything or any area of work. So that's broad consent, and we've also got blanket consent, which is the consent given for everything. And then we also talk about opt-out, so presumed consent unless the participant opts out. So we've got these models. None of them are perfect, but I've got some notes on yesterday's presentation. So in Brazil, for example, specific consent is needed for every time you need to conduct a study. So you ask the patients every single time. And I think in South Africa, in the Cape, patients want specific consent on the study, so you need to ask them, which I think it's quite a different type of model versus broad consent. So broad consent is what I looked at in Thailand. So we looked at broad consent for research, and even with broad consent, not many people understood what they were getting themselves into. So as Mike said, consent is not perfect, which means that governance is really important. And we talked a little bit about governance yesterday, international governance and all that. So clearly, one size doesn't fit all, and that's what led to our discussion on engagement. So engagement is important and will be important as a supplement, if you like, to this whole on how to make data sharing acceptable. So we agree that engagement is important, and as Mike said, that there's a danger of letting engagement do all the work. So we need to think clearly about what we mean by engagement, what are the goals of engagement. And I've done engagement for the past, 5 years now. It's really, really hard. What do you actually do? It's more than providing education. It's supposed to be a two-way process. And how do we do engagement? Who do we do engagement with? Who do we engage with? How do we engage with, for example, traditional healers that someone mentioned yesterday? What do we do with witchcraft? And how do we measure the impact of engagement? So we've looked at evaluation of engagement for years now. It's really, really difficult, but not impossible. So given that consent and engagement are imperfect, what else should we do? We touched on equity yesterday. Susie mentioned that in her keynote, but didn't really delve too much into it. And that's what the next session is about, isn't it? Thank you very much.
Thank you.